Andrew as I came in the door a while ago, and I asked him how things were going, and it's just such a busy season. And so when we have a topic that, we just really have fun with, it makes it more enjoyable on my end of this. But seed saving is a very interesting topic, because if you think about through the years, people didn't go to Atwoods or Lowe's or the local garden center to buy their seeds. Those have been around for quite some time, but if you think about historically, we didn't have, like years ago, those weren't an option. So how did they navigate growing gardens and that kind of thing? So I might just take a minute here too. Most of you probably know me, and I see a lot of familiar faces, but I am Carla Smith with the Oklahoma State University Cooperative Extension Service. So every county has an extension office, and I am your resource for garden information here in our county. So feel free to reach out to me with any questions, any topics of gardening. But our office also offers assistance for agriculture, livestock, pastures, health and nutrition, a lot of different types of things, as well as the 4-H program. So just know that you can reach out to our office with lots of questions. Sometimes there's things that we don't do ourselves, but we may be able to connect the dots and get you to the resource that you're searching for. So when we talk about seed saving, we've talked about this just a little bit in one of our earlier programs. And so when we think about seeds and heritage, many times, I think this is very pertinent for the tribal conversations, because many of the tribes moved from place to place, whether that was their culture at the time or by being relocated. And so people that migrated to America from other countries also had this type of experience where if they knew in advance that they were traveling or moving to another country or area of the country, seeds were a very important part of that. The agriculture lifestyle and that need to have food was very critical in their success when they traveled. If you think about the westward travel across the United States, when people, went west, to find those new lands and explore and to do those kind of things, seeds were taken with them. That was part of their livelihood. And so that also brings into conversation native plants. So native plants would be plants that will grow in that local area. Some people take native plants as to be what grows in my county. Some people would define that as what grows in Oklahoma, and some people define that as what grows in the United States. So when we think about plants that are introduced, that can take on a wide variety of meaning. What grows in Arkansas may or may not grow here, so if you think about it in those kind of contexts. And then we think about native people. A lot of times the people that are here now, this may not be their native land. And so the plants that are native to them culturally may not match the native plants that grow in that region here. So if you relocate, you have to adjust, and so that was often part of the conversation. So native plants grow, you kind of say locally to that area. So if we think about Oklahoma, things that are native for this type of conversation would be our pecans, sand plums, blackberries, things that grow here. They've been here for a long time. So if we think the things that are introduced, Bermuda grass is not native to Oklahoma. It actually came from Africa. Many people think potatoes came from Ireland. Well, they were actually in South America first, taken to Ireland, and then introduced into the Americas. So, sometimes you have to trace back a little farther. That origin or original origin may have a different meaning. So, how many of you have your garden planted? And it's growing? You're excited? Okay. So, we're at a point in the season, many of us, some things we've had harvest on. Sugar snap peas, the early crops, lettuce, spinach, and those kind of things were already at the harvest stages. How many of you are growing lettuce that's gone to flower? So see, it hasn't set seed yet.
I don't really know much about it. I took a stalk of romaine lettuce that I had for dinner, and I put it in water and rooted it, and then threw it in a pot, and I just was kind of experimenting, and I didn't know that it would flower. So I was really shocked and surprised, and then disappointed because I hadn't really harvested any before it flowered, and I read up on it and learned that it's less delicious when it's flowering because it's using up. But I was also proud of the fact that I took that scrap and like let the plant complete its life cycle. So I'm just learning. I don't really know what I'm doing. That's why I'm here.
That's a great example. So thank you for sharing. So a lot of our cool season crops are leafy greens. They will bolt or go to flower as the weather warms up. So in Oklahoma, we usually have to grow those early, February, March, April. We may still have some in the garden that hasn't gone to flower yet. And a lot of times when it bolts or flowers, the lettuce becomes, or spinach, will become bitter and the flavor is not as good. If it's still acceptable and still tastes good, you can still harvest at that stage. But many times that's kind of once you've eaten bitter lettuce, you know that you just know it's not pleasant. And so as things progress in their life cycle, when they get to that point where they flower, then they will set seed. So we're going to talk a little deeper on what we can collect seed on, because if it's a hybrid, the seed of that next generation won't be true to seed, or likely won't be true to seed. A hybrid, well, let me finish this part first. So this one is kind of a casual conversation. I hope that comes across okay on the video. But when we look at things that we can collect seed on, we want to wait until they are mature. So learning that life cycle, learning that process of when they flower and either make a produce like a fruit or tomato, like is shown here in the bottom photo, or it may be a seed pod, or this would be like a coneflower type seed. This is more of a prickly pod, where many of our herbs and lettuce and those kind of things may be more of a dry seed that forms where those flowers are. So you have to learn what that mature stage is for that particular plant. A lot of our plant families, if you think about, radish, turnip, those things that are in a similar family, they're going to flower and produce seed in a similar way. So we can kind of think about, how they grow and observe how they set seed. Many times we don't see that. In our garden at the extension office, I have let kale go to the point where it flowers and goes to seed, as well as radishes. Typically we harvest them before they get to that point. But if they go to flower and set seed, if it's not a hybrid or it's an open pollinated, we'll explain that, you can collect those seed and carry them over. So that this conversation is going to be, how do we go about doing that? What do we watch for? I have a lot of examples to show you today, and then when we finish, I have a table over here with some things that you can take home with you if you like. So there's some seeds that I've collected and dried, and so our focus of this series has been on vegetables. Some of my examples will be pollinator plants as well, because at our office garden, we do have the butterfly garden, and that's where a lot of my seed supply comes from. But this can work for plants that we grow and cultivate. It can also work for things that might be wildflowers or native plants like orange milkweed for the monarch butterflies. That grows in our pastures, and if we catch it and know what to watch for after it blooms, we can collect those seed. And that's actually the best way to propagate those instead of digging them up and taking them home. Collecting the seed is not disturbing the environment as much, and then it's also much more successful on our end because they don't transplant well. So a lot of those plants that we might like to have that are growing in our pasture area, a lot of the wildflowers, collecting the seed rather than the plants is a friendlier option for the environment, and we're more successful with it in the end. Does anybody have any questions at this point?
I just have to say that I'm really glad I came because across the street from my house in this pasture, there's some orange milkweed, and I'm like, I was thinking about going over there and digging it up, but you just nailed it. I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna watch it, learn the life cycle, go get some seeds. So glad I'm here.
Yay. And I have a page, I didn't bring that one with me. If you'll email me or let me know, I have a page on a method for germinating milkweed seeds. You put them in the refrigerator in a moist, like vermiculite or moist soil for 30 days. That gives them it's called stratification. And then when you pull them out, we did this with our Master Gardener class last year, and we had them germinate within 7 days. And I've never, in what I've done with milkweed in the past, seen that fast of a germination. And so we had really healthy plants, it worked really well. So I was really excited to learn a new technique myself.
I was also gonna say, my friend's got to give me two, well, she lives on my land, and she dug up two milkweed plants, and I've been watering them, and everything, the bottoms are dying. She said, I think I get the taproot of them. She got the clay all the way around and everything, but I don't know what to make it. Because we knew they did transplant, well, she thought, well, we got that taproot, so I'm glad to hear this about the seed.
Often we'll try, and sometimes it's, once in a while something might make it, but many of our wildflowers do have very deep roots. That's how they survive, and so if we can collect the seed on them, then, they're growing and you're transplanting them either at a much younger stage, if you're growing them in a pot, or sometimes we can direct seed them in the garden. So there's a lot of options for that where we can have a better success on the other side. So when we think about this year's garden, collecting seeds is something we generally will do later in the season. Typically that's going to be our late summer or early fall. But again, if it's lettuce, that would be earlier in the year. It's when that particular plant hits its life cycle of maturity. And so we have to kind of watch and learn what that is for different plants. So if it's a cool season crop, that might be like the end of April or May. Whereas if it's a summer crop, we're usually looking at September, October timeframe. So when we collect seeds, that maturity, learning that maturity is really important. Who collects seeds? So many people have experimented with that. And some of the things I have here today are things that I collected. And then I have, I think, 3 or 4 things over here. I know 2 are from a OHCE member from our office group that they were doing a seed saving program, and she had some left, and she's like, hey, do you want these? I was like, yes. And so the zinnias and marigolds came from her. There's some hardy hibiscus that I believe one of the master gardeners had brought, and so I have hardy hibiscus seed as well. So many people collect seed, but how do they do that commercially? How do our seed companies do that? Well, in Oklahoma, there is a seed company. Johnston Seed Company is based out of Enid, Oklahoma. So if you think about climate-wise, they are in a drier part of the state. So we don't have a lot of the large seed companies here because it's so humid. They like to produce seeds on a commercial level where it's very dry. Humidity tends to create issues with diseases. And we do have a lot of insects in Oklahoma. So if you can think about a cooler, drier climate, typically their winters are colder is what I'm meaning. They have less insects that overwinter, but usually it's more that disease issue that we would be concerned about. So because of our rainfall and our humidity, we don't have a lot of commercial seed companies here. So that's something to think about. So they will grow in big fields, and we will talk some about open pollinated. There are certain things that they can cross-pollinate in nature. And so there has to be a distance between one variety and the next one to keep that variety pure. So they can use greenhouses to facilitate that, or they can use distance. So you don't want the pollen to cross-pollinate if you're growing a true variety. So that's just some background on the commercial side.
So does that have something to do with whenever I planted red cannas and yellow cannas, the next year they were all orange cannas?
Occasionally on cultivated varieties, if the red ones and the yellow ones had been across at some point, they can revert back to a parentage variety. So normally cannas don't change color a whole lot, but they come back from the roots. So that is not a seed situation. It's not a cross. Some of our plants that are variegated, meaning they have like bright colors in the leaf besides green, if they grow in the shade, they will revert back to the solid green instead of having the color. So on perennials, if that color has changed, it's probably created from a cross, and then when it dies back, sometimes a weather event or environmental conditions, like the light for some of the variegated plants, if the winter environment changes, then they can revert back to a parent of their cross if they were developed from a cross. That gets into some genetics and a deeper conversation, but sometimes we wonder, we may purchase something that says, red and yellow, and then we end up with something different. So plants can adapt and they go through changes, and so sometimes that is how a new variety is picked, because we might have a crop of, say, red poinsettias, and you get one white one in the group. Well, that's unusual, right? But over time, if they select that white one and take cuttings on it, today there are many varieties of poinsettias because they have crossed and selected varieties when they have, that's called a sport, when it's not true to the normal variety. So that can get into some very deep conversations, and I'm not a geneticist, but it's very interesting, and it's part of the conversation that we have with seed saving. So if we think about, why would we collect seed? So if you love growing tomatoes, and you go to the store to purchase your tomatoes, and they don't have your favorite variety this year, so you go to another store. Well, maybe they have it, maybe they don't. If it's a variety, like an heirloom variety, Cherokee purple tomato, if that's your favorite and you just love that one, you can collect the seed on that one, and that way you know that you have that seed and you can grow that again next year. If the industry side changes, if it's not available when you go to the store, by saving seed, you know that you have your favorite variety. So breed traits that you prefer. So if you are a little more advanced, and some people will develop their own crosses. They can, grow tomatoes that they like, and then they can cross-pollinate in a very controlled way. You have to bag the flower so that it doesn't naturally pollinate. And then as the humans can come in and take the pollen from the one that they want to and cross-pollinate to create those hybrids or crosses. So to get a stable hybrid takes several years of genetic work, but breeding is part of that, and that is how, when we look at a seed catalog, they will have new release or exclusive. Those usually cost a little bit more, and it may have better resistance, it may have better production, it might be a new color. So there's a lot of traits to that, and there's a lot that is done with plant breeding. So educational is another reason to collect seeds, as far as it's something that is fun if you're working with children, and just public in general that maybe not have a background in gardening. It helps to learn that life cycle. Where do our plants come from? How do we grow these things? And when they are grown from seed, then that is something that we can learn as adults, or even, children can learn that as they're learning about how plants grow too. For some people, it's a very fun hobby. If you start down this rabbit trail, you may need an additional freezer, or a box in your freezer so that you will have a location to store these seeds. You have to work out a catalog system or an inventory. We'll talk some more about storage in a little while. But when you can have seeds that you can share with fellow gardeners, you can share them with neighbors or family. When I think it was at Christmas, our family does Christmas stockings, and I did sunflower seeds for my family this year because I told them, you can use these they were bigger bags than this, but you can feed the birds, if you want to feed the wildlife with the seeds. That's one reason, we collect seeds also if it's a food crop. Or you can save them till April, plant them outside, and you can grow your own sunflowers. So I didn't want them to feel obligated, I gotta go plant these flowers, So, it can be something fun that you can use as a teaching tool or just, as a connection for those that like to garden. This picture shows quite a few different varieties. We'll talk a little more in depth about storage. But I want you to kind of note, we've got some recycled items here. A medicine container. The film canisters kind of are a little obsolete unless you happen to have a stash. Mint boxes, spice containers, little envelopes or little plastic bags. I like the little jewelry bag, or you can get these at craft stores. Sometimes you can get them at the grocery store, dollar section of the grocery store now too. These are often used for jewelry, craft type items, but they're very handy and inexpensive. You can see what's in them also. Some people really prefer the old-fashioned paper version, and if you do internet, a lot of the patterns or templates for those are online. If you like the paper packet, if you use this type of packet, you can write on them very easily, and that is convenient. But then I would still take all of these and store them inside a plastic of some type so that it preserves the moisture. We'll talk about drying, but you don't want them to get freezer burned. So a Ziploc bag or a container with a lid is going to be helpful. A lot of times we'll also talk about labeling. You can see this one down here, the little mint box has Cleone written on it. And then we have, spice containers. A lot of times these can be repurposed for seeds as well. So our focus for the class has been more on vegetables. So we'll talk more about vegetable seed collection, but we can also collect them from annuals, perennials. So you mentioned the example about the romaine lettuce from the grocery store. So the way that you were able to get that to continue growing, many of our things like carrot tops or maybe a potato that has sprouted, many of those things can be grown, but not usually in a production standpoint, because much of our produce goes through a cooling process, and it depends for success in seed, that fruit has to be harvested at its mature stage. So for tomatoes, sometimes they're harvested green and ripened in the wholesale house. So if that's the case, those seeds aren't fully mature. So a lot of the things that have gone through cold storage are not going to have viable seed. We may be able to grow the tops or parts of them, but when we think about collecting seed, if they've gone through cold storage, and then also the fact that it could be a hybrid. If we don't know the parentage of that, if we're just purchasing a jalapeno pepper from the store, we may not know if it's a hybrid or open pollinated. We may not have that variety name. And so a lot of times that leads to failure in the seed process.
also worried about, I mean, I don't know much about this stuff, but I was like, is this plant like genetically modified? Like, is this gonna produce things that are not quite like little mutant lettuces? Like, I don't wanna do that. I just kind of grew it kind of as an experiment, but I'm not glad.
So the genetically modified, I didn't put that in here today, but there is a list of about 10 produce items that have been genetically modified. Corn is one that's very common in that discussion. Has it been genetically modified? But most things like spinach has not. So when they label it GMO, well, that's true, but it never was in the first place. I mean, like a lot of the things that are labeled not genetically modified, that hasn't been part of the conversation in that crop in production ever. So, you know, it's true that it's not GMO, but it never was.
Kind of like, of course it's not.
Yes. So beware of marketing on some of those things. And I mean, it is part of the conversation. Some of the hybrids many of the hybrids are done by selection, and some people confuse selection versus genetically modified. So many of our hybrids, like if you're growing a Better Boy tomato plant, and they get fairly tall, they're going to get, you know, they're going to outgrow their tomato cage, you know, and they're going to be tall. So if you're growing in containers and you need something that's going to be a little more compact, you don't have a huge garden space, maybe it's a raised bed garden, you need things that are going to stay a little smaller. So you buy the Better Bush tomato variety that's not going to get out of hand. They'll get some size on them, but they're not going to get near as large. So over time, they took the Better Boy tomatoes and they just kept picking the shortest ones. And as you pick the shortest ones, you're going to get to the point where you have a stable, shorter plant. So that's selection, not genetically changing that plant. So there's a lot of confusion with that, and you can Google genetically modified, and there are some lists of what exactly is and isn't, and it's a much shorter list than most people would think. It's used heavily in marketing though. So on this one, this is just a bedding plant, Coleus, but on a plant tag, when you purchase a plant, it should say the variety name. Usually that's in Latin. Usually those are a little bit hard to read. I mean, it's not a spoken language necessarily, but where it says hybrid, you know, that's how you know. When you purchase a plant, on a seed packet from the store, it will say hybrid right below the name if it is a hybrid. And sometimes it'll say hybrid and it will list what crosses that is from. So, you know, there's a lot of information on our labeling that way. And so if it is a hybrid, you could take cuttings on this to propagate it, but you're not going to be able to collect seed and grow something that's going to be true to seed. So when we think about things from the grocery store, they may not be mature seed. Okay, can you try that and see? It might work. Things like butternut squash are usually one that we can collect seed on, but the maturity of when it was harvested is what comes into play on if it's going to grow. So some varieties are hybrids and some varieties are not. California Wonder is an older variety that we've had for a long time, and it's stable and it's one we can collect seed on. I have a couple of pepper varieties that I got from a field day. One is called Mad Hatter, and it's an Italian sweet pepper. It's very sweet, it's great for cooking, and I got some seed from OSU OKC when I went there for a field trip, and they said, hey, if you want some, pick them. And so I took them home, and when I cooked with them, I saved the seed. And so I was able to save enough that I planted some last year and had harvest, and then collected seed again. So I have some plants started, and it's just one that's an unusual shape. It looks like that Italian red painter's hat. It's rounded on the top and has this little flare at the bottom, and it's has an incredible flavor. It's great for salads, but it's not one you're going to go to any of the local stores and find. It's a unique variety. So a lot of times we can look at a seed catalog now, and they will list whether it's a hybrid, but they are also promoting heirloom seeds. So if it's promoted as an heirloom, it is one that you can save seed on. So that's an easy way to tell if you're purchasing seed packets or if you're looking at a seed catalog. So when we talk about flowers, we talk about male and female, and that's something that's kind of foreign to some people. It's a plant, you know. But we do have male and female plant parts of a flower. So it takes both parts, of course, to join and to create that mature seed. A lot of times it will form a fruit, and then we have the seed that's inside of that. So our open pollinated things are things that insects, birds and wind are going to assist in that pollination. So there's different methods. On some of our plants, we might have female flowers on one plant and male flowers on another plant. So there's certain things that we have to have two different ones in order to get a successful pollination. So that's something, apple trees. You have to have two different varieties of apples in order to get good pollination. You may have an apple tree that produces and you may only have one, but you may have a neighbor within enough distance that they're able to cross-pollinate. So on some of our plants, the male and female part of the flower is on one flower on one plant. And so then it is called self-pollinated. So this gets into plant biology, and some of you have question marks on your faces. and I understand that that's a different conversation. But even on things like pecan trees, there are, on the same tree, there are male flowers and female flowers. You mean to tell me that a pecan tree flowers? Yes, if you were here last month, Becky talked about that. And it's not the big frilly flower like a sunflower. We don't notice it. They're very small plant parts that we don't even really notice. But there is a pollination factor. And so plants that can pollinate themselves would be like a tomato plant. We don't have to do anything. The male and female part are on the same flower. And through wind, usually, that's not a problem in Oklahoma, wind and insects will help pollinate those. Tomatoes is a good example of that. Our squash plants, often, some people will say, my squash plant is blooming, but I'm not getting any fruit. I'm not getting any squash. Usually on a squash plants, the first blooms that develop are male. There are different flowers that will develop that are female. And there's a way to visually tell which ones are which, but they are one that the pollinators really help a lot with cross-pollination on those. Honeybees, bumblebees are going to help move that pollen from one flower to the other. So that's just part of the biology of how the plants grow. So if they are open pollinated or self-pollinated, not a hybrid, then we can save the seed. Does anybody have questions on that? If I had a sunflower, it could be self-pollinated or it could be a hybrid. If I don't know what I'm starting with, then I don't know. These are dwarf sunspot sunflowers. I'll pull those out in a minute. But when I purchased them, they were an heirloom, and so I knew that they were a variety that I could save seed on. So things that, vegetable-wise, that we can collect seeds from. This list are things that can be, so watch for these things that are heirlooms. If it says hybrid on the tag, don't save the seed. If it says heirloom, then we can save the seed. So tomatoes are one that we have both in the industry, and so we just have to learn which ones to look for. Cucumbers, pumpkins, squash, gourds, watermelon, cantaloupe, strawberries. Strawberries are often grown from division, but they can be grown from seed. Roses, we don't typically grow roses from seed, but usually that's done from cuttings, but it can be done. If you think about roses, our old-fashioned wild roses, the rugosa rose, the ones that are native here, they will propagate by seed. Many of our tea roses are going to be hybrids. They will not. So is anybody totally confused? I know that's a lot to take in. Yes.
A lot of like a native rose bush, I think I have one down on it's white. So would it be better to like cut, a bridge off and try to put some of that white powder stuff and stick it over to get the seed on? Which would be better?
Either one. From seed, they will be slower. Usually a cutting will be faster. And years ago, I had tried to move some wild roses, and much like the milkweed, I did not have success. They tend to grow where they want to grow. They have those roots to survive, and when we disturb those, the birds can plant them where they wish and they will grow. But when we decide we want one by the front gate, it doesn't work always.
Is it true? I've heard that you can take a cutting from a rose and drill a little hole in a potato and shove it down in the potato, and that the potato will nourish it until it, I don't know, I've heard that's a way to start a rose.
I have seen it. I have not attempted it. Potting soil is a go-to that I would, we can root them in potting soil. A potato is going to provide some moisture, and there might be some validity to it under the right conditions, but it's not something that I have done. Sometimes I've seen some pretty bizarre, suggestions online, and so kind of think about, in a certain situation, it could have worked. I'm not saying that it didn't, but it's not something that is necessarily like from an industry standpoint or like a production standpoint, but something like an avocado seed. They're not hardy here, but you can stick like toothpicks in the side of them and root avocado seed usually and grow a little avocado plant. They won't produce because they won't get mature enough indoors in order to get avocados, but we can grow them. So there's a lot of things that are sometimes we may be able to grow a plant. A lot of that may be regionally, but as far as growing the cuttings, you may be able to get them to root potatoes. Sometimes we just need a moist environment. So it might work, but sometimes if it sounds too good to be true, so there are some things that may be put out there that may not be legit, so just use some caution, or try it, just test it and see. But
I'm the lady that will do it just to see what happens.
and a lot of times when we do research, we do a replicated study. If you do something once and it works, is that okay? You have that result. But if you do it 3 times and it works, you have more confidence in that. Sometimes we might get something that works. It was just, the conditions came together and it was just right. But we like to make sure that that's a true result. Do it more than once. And, when you have a replicated study under controlled circumstances, then that gives you a more confidence in that test. So, these examples, the one up at the top, we have an apple, cross-section of an apple. And so some people will say, oh, well, I grew a plant from an apple seed. And you may be able to do that, but many of our fruit trees, are, many are hybrids, but then also they are grafted. So the fruit is coming from the upper part of that graft and is one variety, and the rootstock for cold hardiness is a different variety. So the top variety, if you just grow the seed from that, it may not be cold hardy in our climate. So there's a lot of things with that. You go to a lot of trouble and time to grow a peach or an apple, something, you know, from seed that way. And if we start with a recommended cultivar or that hardy rootstock, we're going to have more success. So it's not to say that it might not grow, but it might not be fruitful or be cold hardy. So tomatoes are one that often we can save seed on. In the past 5 years, the heirloom tomatoes have become very popular. There's many varieties. I can tell you from growing some of those, if they're not a red tomato, you know, when you start to harvest a purple tomato and you haven't grown them before, what shade of purple is ripe? You know, it takes some practice. Some of them are striped. You know, they have this variation color in them, and so sometimes that's a little trial and error on when is that produce ready to harvest. If you grow the solid, you know, red ones, you kind of know that deep red color and when that's ready. When we look at things like cantaloupe or squash or pumpkin, they have those seeds in the center. When we go to cook those and prepare those, we're going to scoop that part out. For pumpkins, we may eat the seeds as well. You know, we may roast those. But when we get to this point, we would scoop the seeds out and then we would wash them. You separate the pulp from the seed, and you can use a colander or a screen and wash the slimy part, the plant parts off of them. And then you would lay those out on a paper plate, paper towel, some newspaper, and let those dry. So when we lay something out to dry like that, a lot of times I'll use a paper plate because you can move them if you need to. A paper towel gets kind of, you know, they're not going to move as easily. So a paper plate works really well. And it's going to be something that you're going to need to let air dry for 2 to 3 weeks. So a lot of times we might think, okay, in a couple of days, you know, it seems dry, but we do want to make sure that that surface moisture and some of that internal moisture dries also. So 2 to 3 weeks is a good rule of thumb when we're laying something out like that. And so how many of y'all have had like a pumpkin, a jack-o'-lantern on the porch or something, and then you throw it in the back corner of the yard or in the compost pile, and the next year you have a vine growing? So sometimes they will survive in nature on their own. So that is that survival mechanism, and we can take advantage of that. Watermelon is another one that also would be in this group that we can separate the seeds and then save them. On watermelon, there are some that have the little tiny white seeds. That one will not be viable. If it is a seedless watermelon, sometimes you'll have just those little very thin white seeds in them. The black seeds that have the harder coat are going to be just like from a traditional regular watermelon, those would be the ones that you would save. And again, on watermelon, we can have hybrids or we can have a straight variety, and you have to do your homework to know which ones that is. I passed a man selling watermelon on the road down here as I came, and so if you were purchasing watermelon beside the road, you could ask what variety, and they may or may not be able to tell you. If they can tell you it's a Charleston watermelon, and you could go home and Google if that's a hybrid, you could consider saving the seed. But if they don't know, you know, or they you know, if you don't have that accurate information, then you can't determine if it's a hybrid or not.
I have a question about watermelon.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry, I don't know if this is interactive instructional. But, so I saw this thing about how old watermelon originally, like, before we have messed with it, like the rind was really thick and there wasn't much meat to the watermelon and there were a lot of seeds. And so we have modified it, however, I don't know how that works, but now that we have the watermelon that we have now, and it's, you know, it's got less rind, more meat, it's sweeter, fewer seeds. So is that like genetically modified, or is that one of those things that you were talking about where they altered it just over time, kind of like breeding dogs, where you get the favorable traits and just do it that way? Is that, so are watermelons from the grocery store, like, are they legit?
That's a very good question. So yes, some of both. So in a lab, they can genetically determine like these genes are the sweetness factor. They can kind of determine a lot genetically at a very high level of science. But in early production, they would have selected, and even now, you know, you have plants that just perform incredibly well. And so if you were doing a seed trial and you had, you know, 100 plants, you might pick your top 10 by plant performance, by produce evaluation. A lot of times they will weigh them, they will measure them, they will separate the rind from the meats from the seeds. And there are so many different ways they can evaluate that. So they might test that on 100 different, you know, vines and then select the top 10. There is some genetic, you know, crossing and that kind of thing that can be done as well. I'm not as familiar with the history on watermelons specifically, but that's an interesting, you know, conversation. So when we do a Google search, like if we're looking up that information, you can either put like EDU in the search bar or EXT to get extensions based research. And so by looking up plant trial information and by researching that's an interesting conversation. And so a lot of times, I can't answer that fully, but we can look into that and see where that goes. So by looking at how they, the history of that seed production, we can learn a lot from that. It's a really good question. So if you were going to select seeds from, you know, to save, some things to think about is we want a pretty healthy produce to start with. If we have something that is spotted, sometimes these can get to a point where they just aged and they've gotten older or are starting to deteriorate. But something like this or something like this can be a disease. It can be a fungus that could be carried over through the seed to the next generation. So things that would affect melons and squash would be like anthracnose and downy mildew and different types of diseases. We don't want to carry those over to our next season. So we don't want to save seed on things that are blemished, or this one has some very distinct fungal patterns. Even this where we have pitting, this may have been insect damage. This discoloration could come from a number of different things, you know, and so we want to, if we're wanting some pretty pie pumpkins so that we can, you know, have some nice pies at Thanksgiving, we would want to select pretty well-colored, well-formed, fresh but mature fruits. If these were still green, you know, they hadn't matured to develop their full color, we want to wait until they have their full color of a mature plant. We want to look both at the produce itself and then also the vines. If the vines are diseased and not thriving and doing well, then that would be an indication that we don't want to save seeds from those plants. So when we have something like a pulpy fruit, the slimy seeds from a tomato, sometimes when people make salsa or a sauce, they're going to strain out the seeds. Some people don't mind the seeds. So, but like if you were making a spaghetti sauce, A lot of times, my homemade sauce has some seeds in it. But if you think about when you go to the store and buy a jarred spaghetti sauce, it doesn't have very many seeds in it. So they do have that pulpy, slimy covering on them. And so I have saved seeds from tomatoes where I have simply taken them out, put them on a paper towel or on a paper plate, and let them air dry. You can do that, but just know when you plant them, it takes a little bit longer for them to grow because they have that coating. As that slimy coating dries, it becomes a harder coating, and it's a little bit sticky, and it's on the outside of that seed. Well, this is a method that I have tried once, but I didn't have the patience for it to end successfully. But you can remove the tomatoes, you scoop the seeds out and put them in a glass jar. You add warm water and you let it set. Room temperature, and I was even told outside is better, that the heat of outdoors, our houses, we have cooler, and so the heat of the summer can help this process happen faster. So I did this step, and I did this step, and I got to this step. An old pickle jar can work really great. You can use a canning jar. And so then you get to this stage. And the mold growth was a little more than, you're supposed to scoop off the mold that grows, and you repeat that several times. Well, I think my kids were in basketball camp and life got busy, and it just got really funky, and I just stopped there. So this is something that if you don't like the goo and the mess, it might not be for you. Like I said, I just dry mine and know they're just going to take a little longer to germinate. But this process ferments that layer of pulp, and then the seeds will settle out. And it does work if you're patient to walk through that. I have talked to other educators who have done this. And so the fermentation process can kill viruses, and it gets rid of that pulpiness. And so when you germinate your seeds the next year, they germinate faster. Well, that would be ideal. But you have to scoop out the mold and then repeat the process until you are down to seeds. So this is one of the methods for collecting tomato seeds. So the nice thing about peppers is they're not slimy. Saving pepper seeds is much easier. If you are new to saving seeds, that's a really easy place to start. I have saved seeds from Mad Hatter, from California Wonder, from jalapeno, several peppers, and as long as it's not a hybrid, you can save those seeds. There's a sweet cherry pepper. Years ago when we used to go to Pizza Hut, my dad always liked those round sweet peppers that we would get at Pizza Hut. And so, it's like I got seed from those, and I'm able to save those from year to year. They're great in a salad and as a garnish because they're just little and they're pretty.
Have you pickled them before?
Yes.
I bet they're so good when you grow them yourself.
Yes. One year I had a bumper crop of jalapeno peppers. I had planted some so I'd have enough for salsa, and it was one of those really hot summers, and they just kept producing. And we had a longer season, so into the fall, I was picking jalapenos in October. They had produced all summer, and it's like, what am I going to do? So I made candied jalapeno peppers. I used sugar and vinegar, and I actually kind of created a recipe, but anyway, my boys were in college, and every time they came home, they got another jar or two to take back with them. And so they just ate them like candy. I'm not a fan of, just personally, of really spicy food, but they were really good, evidently, or my kids loved them. So anyway, so a coffee filter is something I hadn't mentioned. That's another thing that works great. You just need something to lay them on. A paper plate works great. And a lot of times when I'm drying seeds, I'll use the paper plate, and then I'll I'll use it for the next batch. I mean, like, you can use those more than once sometimes. So you'll need to store them in a container. We've talked about several options for that. You do want to be sure to label them. And so there's two things we want to really think about when we label seeds, and that would be the year and the variety. So if, like I mentioned earlier, if you get into seed saving and it becomes a passion, you will need something to store those in. I have one of those large cookie tins that I have a lot of little packets of seed in, but you need to put the year on them because the life of those, they're not going to last forever. And you need to use seeds up within a certain length of time. They will lose viability over time. But many seeds will last for several years. I have a slide to discuss that a little bit more. So label the container. When I was a kid and we would garden, we had a little well house, and that's where our deep freeze was. It's where we kept some garden tools, and it's where we kept the garden seed. If that's just where our things landed. And so if we had seed left, we would use that up before we purchased seed. I don't know if it created any issues or not, but now I know that heat is the biggest issue for lowering germination. And so if we can store those seeds in a cool, dry location, commercially, that would be a freezer. So many greenhouses that have production greenhouses have a designated freezer. There's usually a list on the door, an inventory type thing, and then the seeds are stored in a deep freeze at a monitored temperature. So if you don't have a deep freeze or freezer space available, then a refrigerator would be the next best place. So keeping those seeds cool will help retain the viability of those seeds. So one of our vegetable specialists on campus, even if he is planting a research plot, he makes sure to order his seeds in the wintertime. So they're not in shipping and stuck in a UPS truck or a mailbox, or on campus, that's university mailing, so that they're not stuck on a loading dock in the heat. He orders his seeds so that they arrive when the weather is cool. If he goes from his office to the research station to plant seeds, they're in a cooler. He just carries a lunchbox cooler, and he has the seeds in that because he doesn't want to reduce the risk of those seeds not having good viability. If you're doing a research project and you want to be able to control, as much as you can, if you leave a seed on the dash of a hot truck, you're losing germination, if those seeds get too hot. So, if you have room to refrigerate, chill, freeze those seeds, that is going to be your best option.
Can they get freezer burned?
They can. That's why if you're going to be using an envelope or something that's in paper, I would recommend putting those then inside of a Ziploc bag or a glass jar or a container with a lid. The extra layer of material will help prevent freezer burn.
Maybe some of those Ziploc freezer.
Yes. Yes. So when I use these little jewelry bags, they then do go inside a freezer bag before they go into my freezer. I just have a little chest deep freeze and it is not frost free. So if you have like a side-by-side refrigerator and it's frost free, you will need to use your seed more, use it on a regular basis and rotate those seeds. I've kept them in a side-by-side for years and had fine germination, but there's a way you can test germination as well. So if you have some seed and you have a pretty good supply, these are striped sunflower seeds. Say I've had these in the refrigerator for 4 years. They're a large seed, they should hold. But all I have to do is take a paper towel and get it damp, not dripping, but get it wet and squeeze it out. Lay it out and then place 10 seeds down the paper towel and roll it up. Then you put it in a Ziploc bag. And usually within a week, sometimes it depends on the seed. It might take 2 weeks, but many seeds will germinate in 3 to 5 days. So then you can take it out in 3 to 5 days and you unroll it. And you can see if those seeds are swelling and germinating. If you just check the progress. If they're not germinated yet, you roll it back up and stick it back. When you do that, you do want that in a warm location. I've done this in the windowsill of the office, and I meant to do that before today, but it was something that slipped my mind. But like, you can take 10 green bean seeds or sunflowers, you roll them up in a paper towel, and then you can count how many germinated. So if you had 10 seeds, and you had 8 germinate and 2 did not, that's 80%. By using the 10, it's easy to do the math and create a percentage. So if you had very special seeds that you only had a few, would you do a germination test? So yeah, probably not, because you wouldn't want to, you wouldn't want to waste them. So sometimes we will go ahead and attempt germinating them to grow them, but you don't want to, usually if we're doing a germination test, it's because we have a larger supply and we don't mind sacrificing to understand what that germination rate is. Commercially, they have germination chambers where they will take varieties of a seed and test the germination. There are seed banks that's how they protect the seed supply, is they will store seeds for a long period of time, and periodically they will take them out and do a germination test and see if the seeds are still viable. There's a lot of science behind that, and a lot of people have no idea that even happens. But the seed banks are a way for protecting that seed supply. And so that's important for our food production crops. So if we think about, like, here we have like a freezer shelf, and there's lots of bags here. If you do use the smaller jewelry bags, that freezer bag is going to help protect them better. And then also, this would be like on a commercial scale. We're not going to save that usually for at home. So there's different methods that you develop once you get to doing this. This one is just a wooden box with a screen. This would probably be maybe like a market gardener. I wouldn't say like full-blown commercial, because they have pretty high-tech ways to do that. And they sometimes even have machines. But a wooden box with a screen, so if you were doing pumpkin or squash. At one point, one of my grandpas grew watermelon for USDA certified seed years and years ago. I didn't find out about it until after he had passed away. But they had a watermelon field, and my dad has memories of them doing the straining process, and they had, I'm not exactly sure what they used, but they would have to take the watermelon and separate the pulp from the seeds. And so they had screens. My dad was not a fan of watermelon, I can tell you, after going through some of that. So anyway, sometimes a strainer, sometimes a colander. There's a lot of different ways. If you've ever done the jack-o'-lantern pumpkin, you know that stickiness and the mess, but that's part of getting our hands dirty when we do this kind of thing. So some of our plants, to transition a little bit, these are more pollinators. We have to learn when those seeds are ready, and some of them tell us very openly, hey, I'm mature and I'm ready to leave this plant. So if you think about a dandelion, this one is, go the other way. This one is a cousin to a dandelion. This one is actually, I have some of it. It's called yellow goat's beard. And if I make a mess, we'll just have to clean it up. Oh, that one's shattered. See if I can do this and not destroy it. So these are huge, and so they're really kind of fun. This one's a little bit misshapen, but that is yellow goat's beard. And so it is in the same family with dandelion, and it is considered a weed or a wildflower. And when you look at it, why does it have this fluff?
To carry the wind.
Yes, so that's its dispersal system. Some of our seeds are dispersed by birds where they will feed on the plant and then they deposit them with their other items, somewhere. So our wind dispersed seeds, the seed is actually this lower part. And then this one has like the little helicopter umbrella, that the wind is going to carry. And so these are kind of fun. This is like a giant dandelion pod. So the other one here that I have in the photo is milkweed. So like the orange milkweed that we've been talking about will form a seed pod. Kind of looks like okra, not exactly, but it will form a green seed pod. And so as that green pod matures, it will turn brown. This picture is mostly the white part, but when that brown pod cracks and opens, then there is all of this fluff that again will blow in the wind and it will disperse the seeds. So if you are growing milkweed for the monarchs and you're growing that for a butterfly garden, if you live next to a cattle operation or a commercial or like a farmer, a rancher that raises livestock, do know that milkweed is not a friend to our livestock. It is toxic to them. Most of the time they won't eat it. If they're eating the milkweed, they don't have enough, grass in the field. So usually they just eat around it and it's not a huge problem. But we want to be good neighbors if we're doing pollinator gardens. And at our office, we don't have cattle next door, but one year I came back from the county fair, just made a trip through the office parking lot, and there was white all over one part of our butterfly garden. Because the seed pods had matured when I wasn't watching, and we just had white fluff everywhere. So the conditions have to be right for those seeds to germinate, and I was a little bit worried that we might have a yard of milkweed plants the next year, but we didn't. So know that if you grow some of these plants that are considered kind of a weed, and that's one reason why I collected these. I wanted the example, but then also I didn't want them all over the lawn. This is one that in the butterfly garden, some of these ladies know, we'll end up with it in different locations. If it's in a location we're okay with, we leave it. But many of those get pulled up just because we don't want them to overtake the garden.
What about wild echinacea? There's a lot of it blooming up on my house, and I want to get some of that intentionally.
Yes, so these are some seed pods from purple coneflower.
Oh, there's another name.
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So the seed pod, actually this is the part that is left after the flowers have fallen away. So this is the center part of that flower, and this is the seed part, or the pod.
If you guys see me pulled over on the side of the road anywhere, pay no mind, I'm probably just taking stuff, yeah.
So this white, lighter colored part is actually the seed. When you pull this apart, you have to then learn to identify which part of that is the seed part. The other part is just plant parts. So commercially, they clean those. They only sell us the seed when they're selling us seed. When I collect seed, I don't necessarily have time to get all the chaff out. And so my seeds that I've collected sometimes come with a little extra organic matter. And so some of them I am able to run through a colander, and you just put them in here and stir until the seeds fall through, or until the extra parts fall through. It depends on the size of the seed. And so you can tell by looking at this one, and I'll just stick these in here and we can pass it around. And so yes, learning what the seeds look like when they're mature. And so sometimes, like I said, later in the season, if you're driving an area that you're real familiar with, or that you're there pretty often, or if it's your own pasture, you can see these plants, and then sometimes we just have to remember to go back and check. Because if that flower has just opened, that middle part may not be mature yet. So we kind of have to wait until, usually when the petals dry up, then we know that that center part is mature. So, like I said, some of these are more obvious than others. A zinnia is going to be very similar to a purple coneflower, where we have the pretty flower, and then it starts to get kind of worn and ragged and not as pretty. If we leave them until they're dry, until that middle part is dry, and I have zinnias over here. Well, I have some little ones that y'all can take. Oh, this is zinnias. So, gotta walk slow. You should see my office sometimes when I'm doing these. So this is the flower petal, and this is actually the seed. So if you were planting and you have this, you just scatter it, and you have some seeds, and like I say, some organic matter. Commercially, if you buy a packet of Burpee seed, they're only going to sell you the seed. I mean, like, they do it by weight, and they have machines that separate this. And so, you know, the patience on my end is sometimes, patience may not be the issue, but time.
Is that organic matter actually going to maybe nourish or fertilize this seed more?
There would be some nutrients to that. I mean, it would just be like, it's just plant parts, natural material. So, yes, that part is actually the seed, and then like this would be a petal, a flower petal. This one may be harder to record, and I'm sorry, but part of this one is hands-on. So, let's see here.
Yeah.
So, when we collect seeds, we're mostly been talking about vegetables as far as terms of this class, but annuals and perennials we can collect seed on. So marigolds is another one.
Mom always called them zinnias.
This one actually kind of has that dried flower. And so, yeah, you've seen these when your marigolds get old. This is actually the seed. So marigold seeds are kind of long and skinny. We think of seeds as being round, but not always. Yes, they're kind of stickery, and like purple coneflowers, when you go to separate those seeds, like leather gloves are handy just because they are stickery and kind of spiny. Not that one is going to hurt, but yeah. Okay. So these, yeah, they're much faster from plants. So yeah, this would be the dried marigold flower, and then these are the seeds over here. Okay, so maybe your life is busy and you want to collect seeds, and you're not sure how you're going to monitor that. So you can take a tool bag and you can net those flowers, and then that way when this matures and dries, you're not losing them. So if you had a very special variety, sometimes if you were hand pollinating something, also they will use a fabric or net bag to cover that flower so that it doesn't pollinate on its own. And then you would come in and pollinate that specifically. So, but as far as in this part of the conversation, you can put a net bag around it, and then that way it's not going to shatter before you get around to coming back to collect those seeds. So the top photo here shows putting a bag over it before you cut it. If that flower head was very fragile, that would be a way to prevent it from shattering when you pick it. But then, okay, we may be growing lots of stuff in the carpet. So a lot of our herbs also are going to grow where we can collect seed. Dill and fennel, this is dill, is going to grow on a tall stalk. And so I do have a picture of that here in a second. So this is dill, and so when it's dry, I usually will just cut it and put it in a brown paper sack, and then it usually would go in a file cabinet in my office. You can dry them in a paper sack so that things like this that are going to shatter and kind of be messy, you can put them inside of a paper sack and set them aside or hang them. And then you want good air circulation and out of direct sunlight. But by doing that, it allows them to dry. And usually, once they're dry at this stage, then you can take the bag and just You can take the bag and crumple it, and then you pull out the stems and the seed are in the bottom. So I can pass this around too. I mean, this is just another deal. So if you do use the paper bag method, you can kind of crunch that up, pull the stems out, and your seed will be in the bottom. So it just makes it a little bit easier. Once I get to that point and I have the loose seeds, I still put them on a paper plate for a couple of weeks. They've dried in the bag, but I just want to make sure that they are good and dry before I contain them.
I love those tiny little bags.
Yes. When it comes later in the season, I have a stash of them for collecting seed at the office. And sometimes, there might be a corner of my office with 10 bags lined up of something that I'm, usually after the county fair, I'll have time to package them. So you could use scissors or pruners, to cut those stems. If you shake the bag once it's closed, you can separate those once they're dry. And again, then I usually put them on a paper plate, make sure that they're thoroughly dry. Before you package them. If you were using a glass jar to store those, if you put them in the glass jar and you put the lid on it and you get that condensation on the glass jar, they're not dry enough. So you want to make sure that you have them dry enough so that you won't have moisture in that container. And so the timing on this, when can you start collecting seed? Well, it depends on the specific plant, but we have to go through the flowering stage and either the fruit set stage or, kind of that later in the season, usually, unless it were like lettuce or a cool season crop. Most of these things, most of our vegetables and most of our pollinators would be later in the season. Okay, let's check in to see where we are in time. I better keep moving. There are some videos on Oklahoma gardening. This is not picking up my play button. Well, if you want to look up on Oklahoma Gardening's YouTube channel, there are a couple of segments on saving seeds. They're from older segments, but they have done a really good job with some of those. I am not going to play those. I'm not sure that would work. So here is a chart. There are some places where you can look up information on how long seeds will keep. Now that's going to vary with conditions. It's going to vary a little bit with the maturity of those seeds. But in general, the bigger the seed, the longer it will be viable. So here at the bottom we have watermelon, 5 years. Turnips are tiny seed, but they keep real well. So 5 years on turnips. Tomatoes about 4, squash about 5. If we look at something that's a much smaller seed, parsley 2 years, parsnips 2. So there are a typical rule of thumb on how long seeds will keep. So that's why you want the year on there. You want to make sure that you're rotating those seeds, just like anything in your freezer. You know, you want to use it up while it's still good. So some people will put year and month. A lot of times, as long as I get the year on there, I'm satisfied with that. So when I do programming, if I've saved seed, like there's a couple of things here that are examples too of a pod type seed. So think about like a pole bean or something that's going to make a pod. These are ornamentals, but they look like a bean. And so we can pass these around. But on your handout, you're welcome to take a picture, but there's a,
I'm gonna read that whole thing.
I was gonna say if
Just so you know, there's a page, I don't know if you knew that there's a blank page on your handout.
yes, the slides are in consecutive numbers, and the printer and I were not getting along that day, so I don't know why there's a blank page. It's
Oh, but the slides are in there.
yes,
Okay.
the slides are all there. For some reason, it gave us a note-taking page in the middle of the presentation. So, yes, if you want to package them in the little paper envelopes, that works. Just this is kind of like some examples for things to think about. If you purchase seed from the store, it will always have that lot number and that year. So even commercially, they will do that. So if you planted green beans and you put that seed in the freezer and then you pull it out the next year, that date will be on there. If they got lost in the freezer and you find them a couple of years later, you can still look at that and know when those were packaged. So how to make your seed last, we've talked a lot about this already. Commercially, that is done in a very controlled, very specific, intentional way. For the home gardener, your freezer is going to be the best place. And then refrigerator is good also, but protecting them from heat is going to be very important. So some years I have collected more seed than others. We have the butterfly garden at the office. And so when we do programs, it's nice to be able to share those seeds so that you can go home and then you can have a butterfly garden. But for vegetables, it works the same way. So there are certain seeds that you may be able to collect. If you love growing heirloom tomatoes and you want, to save those seeds, learning that process, and then you might have a neighbor who loves to grow squash. Well, y'all get together and share, those kind of things. So that's important when you have a group that may be gardening collectively, like the farm garden. Y'all may want to learn to save seeds to be able to have seeds for next year. And I think last year I planted 7 or 8 sunflower seeds. And so I had plants, all of them had at least one bloom, but some of them had multiple. And so I decided, I'm going to learn how to save sunflower seeds. And so if you look at the hundreds of seed in one head, you know, you can feed the birds with some of them, or you can save some seeds. And they really multiply. I mean, like, you can save one pumpkin and have enough seeds to, you know, to share with several families.
I have a
So
question. Is this yellow bells, is this like a flower?
it is Esperanza or Texas yellow bells. It's a tropical here.
Okay.
Except at our office, we have one that comes back. It's in a microclimate and it does really, really well.
That's what it wants.
Yeah, it's come back pretty often. I hesitate to say that because I don't want to jinx it. It's been there, so I'll pass this sunflower around. So,
My friend has a bear in his house, and part of his diet is feeding him a variety of things, but there's sunflower seeds and certain oils mixed into his food. And a really cool thing about that is that he has planted sunflowers all in his enclosure from his poop. His poop has made lots of sunflowers come up. Thought that was so cool, bear poop, sunflowers.
yes. Well, and that's how a lot of our wildflowers are spread, you know, through the bird activity. But yes, my puppy dog got to stealing tomatoes last year. And she would pick tomatoes and run with them. My garden is fenced this year, so she can't do that. But when I went to weed eat her dog pen the other day, it was like, wait, there are half a dozen tomato plants coming up in Penny's pen. So she has her own garden. So, you know, it's,
From your grandpa down to your.
yes. So, you know, I just went around them. She can have her own tomato plants. I just weed-eated the rest. So here's a good example of dill. When it is growing, it's nice and green and fluffy. The flowers bloom yellow. Here is a caterpillar, a gold fritillary caterpillar feeding on it. And you can see these seeds are still green. We want to collect them after they fully dried and turned brown. In this green stage, they won't be viable. But once they turn brown, and you can see the stem is even brown. So we want to go from this green stage to the brown stage. And we collect quite a bit of dill seed. And this is one that I have to share with you today. I've got packets over here for you. And so this is one that's really easy for me to collect and share. It's an herb. It's one that we can use for cooking and making pickles and dill dip and all those kind of things. We use it to help teach the 4-H kids. You know, it's that connection with, this is, you know, the flavor of a dill pickle comes from an herb that comes from a plant. And so that's a fun way to help connect on a level that they will understand. So they, in our garden at the office, they reseed themselves. And so it is an annual plant, but they drop enough seed. I will usually go out and collect several Brahm sacks as those mature, and so that I have fresh seed. I think this one is marked 2021 for the date. I have a packet here marked 2022. So as I do programming, I need to make sure I use up my older seed first as well. So we want to make sure and utilize that, and sometimes we'll end up with an excess of something. But timing is everything. So like I mentioned, when I came back from the county fair and we had milkweed seeds everywhere, you know, if there's something very special that you want to make sure and collect, maybe it's grandma's zinnias, or, you know, something that's very important to you. You want to make sure that you monitor it close or bag it so that you can not miss that part.
I have a question. I have, I guess they're moonflowers or Jimson weed that my grandma, like, they've been in my family for a long time, and they come out kind of how they want, but I've been trying to take them somewhere else, and I've learned that you have to keep the pod, let it dry out until it's busts open, and you get the tiny seeds and you store them with like a razor or something. Do you know anything about that? Because I've tried that unsuccessfully a couple times.
There are a few seeds that have a very hard seed coat. Waiting until the pod is dry is very important because that means that it's mature. So these are seed pods from a hardy hibiscus. And they are well, I have a tray over there of some more seeds, the actual seeds. The seed coat on the seed itself is hard. And so you have to nick that seed or scar it so that it can absorb water so that it can grow.
Okay, so you're doing that so it can absorb water. That's the missing element I didn't know. I didn't know if I was helping it bust open or what, so that's very helpful.
So when you have that dry seed, there are a few seeds, and milkweed is one. If you have a fire, if you burn a brush pile, and then later you go back and you're gonna see milkweed seeds coming up. So a lot of times fire can trigger some seeds to grow, as well as there are a few that have to pass through an animal. The digestive tract of an animal can scar that seed or kind of treat that seed where it gets rid of the seed coat or does something to trigger that germination. So yes, scarring the seed is one thing, and then like I mentioned on the milkweed seed, if you stratify them, we put them in a moist potting mix or vermiculite in a Ziploc bag in the refrigerator, and then that lets them slowly absorb that moisture, and it kind of simulates winter time, and then when we take them out, then they will grow. So there are some things on propagation or germination that I really didn't go into a whole lot today. I do have a video on sunflower season. It was a whole process of growing and drying the seed on the sunflowers. Let me try something. I don't know. Let me try it over here and see if it works. Oh, there's the button. Sometimes these will play on my computer and then you get somewhere and they don't. Well, I can post this on our Facebook page again. I've shared it before, but I can easily do that, and then that way you can go on there and view it. But this was just photos that I had taken through the season.
Do you know anything about buckeyes? How to grow buckeyes?
Okay, some of our trees, they make a nut, and that is the seed. Buckeyes are a very, very hard nut, and so it's one that I have done some reading on. There's a process of that stratification. Instead of a month, it would be more like a 3-month stratification on some of our tree seeds. It works on pecans, but there's a process of where you put them in cold storage. Then you go through a stage and they have to absorb the water.
Do you crack them or cut them or?
It depends on the specific seed, and I think that moist stratification, if you put them in a media, the moisture will help soften that seed, and then when you take it out of the freezer or refrigerator and put it in a warm climate, then that softer seed covering, the shell, will then be able to absorb water and grow. Or it has absorbed water, so then it can burst and begin to grow. So some of the early slides that I had in this were from a coworker of mine from El Reno, and she had a slide in there about trees, which I had kind of skipped, but I was trying to focus more on vegetables and the process. But we can grow some trees from seed. It takes more patience, and it might be 5 years to go from the seed process to having a tree ready to plant in the yard. So you would have it, possibly in the freezer, refrigerator, in some pots for a while until it's germinated and got large enough to put outside. So it can be done.
I gotta go find it, Mom and Dad dig it up, so.
So sometimes it's that history thing or that family that, we may have a tree. We have a bur oak story in my family. When my oldest son got married, they didn't want to do a unity candle when they had their wedding. they planted a bur oak acorn. And so they got soil from his side of the family and her side of the family, put the soil together at the wedding. I mean, like they each had their jar, they dumped together, and then they planted their acorn. Well, they've moved twice, and that particular tree did not, make it. But when they get settled and have a place for a bur oak tree, we'll plant one. So sometimes there's that connection. The nut that they used actually came from OSU campus, which is where they met, so there's a lot of fun things that you can do with those.
Very meaningful.
Yes. So a lot of times you may have a tree at grandpa's house, or you may have, that historic, tree in the family, or plants of some kind. If we can save the seed and share that with the next generation, that's incredible. And sometimes, like, my son's wedding tree didn't actually grow, but by the time you pack up from a wedding, and I mean, there's a process of all of that. And I told him, it's like, it may not be the same nut, but we can get there. So, I will post this on our Facebook page again for you guys, and I can share it with Gabby, and she may be able to email it or put it on the tribal site as well. But I do have some, wait, it's doing something. I'm not sure what I pushed. So the petals get kind of ragged towards the end of the season. We had tons of bees visit them. They're really fun to watch. That's just a really close-up of the center. So when the head turns upside down, it's starting to mature. And then the outer petals, the yellow part turns brown. And you can see this is still green. And when the back turns to this yellow, and you'll get the browning spots, that's when you hit maturity. This yellow part in the center also becomes dry, and you can just brush it off. So then you know that it's time to cut them. But at this stage, when you cut them, you still have to let them dry. I mean, they're fairly papery at that point. You can dry them in the seed head, like this one that I passed around. Or some of them I went ahead and just crumbled out, and this is the seed. And this one is fairly clean. These are larger seed, and so it was easier to pick through. Was that changed or? So to pull it back into the tribal conversation, this is a sweet potato squash, which is one from the Choctaw heritage. The Choctaw and Chickasaw have done a lot, and they have some seed saving that they do within their tribe to preserve some plant material, their heritage plants that they have used throughout their history. And so some of the tribes have those resources, and some of the tribes don't have any seed bank. And so it's something to know that there was even a partnership. This goes into some of the details, but OSU had helped with them to collect some of those seeds, and then to be able to grow those and collect more seed, so that then they had enough seed to distribute back to the tribe. There are some instances where sometimes they may end up with 3 seeds, and those seeds are very precious. They're down to the last 3 that they know of a certain variety. So then talk about no pressure, to grow those out to maturity, keep the insects and, problems away, but then they can collect those, and over time, they can rebuild that supply. So being able to have that, it's something to think about. For the absentee Shawnee, is there something very specific to your tribe that, that you would want to consider, locating or, finding and then being able to propagate that to share with your tribal members? Sometimes that connection or that exact source may be gone. That seed source may not be available, but you sometimes can work with either another tribe or the local area and find something as similar as you can to pick that up. It's kind of like the bur oak. Know when they get settled and they have property where they can plant a tree, it won't be their bur oak that they, that they originally started with, but they can pick up where that left off and continue that thought. So some of the tribes that have worked on this, preserving the culture, there's a website here that goes to the rest of this article. I wanted to provide that to you. I have not been involved with this directly, but there are some really neat programs where things are being done to help reconnect and to rebuild what can be done in that area. So you guys know you can reach out to me by phone or email anytime, ask any questions. And I think we've talked about a lot of the things here. Some of these I use for teaching examples and for workshops to help people learn about these. But the things on this table over here, I don't have them labeled yet, but y'all can help learn how to do that. So there are some here that are zinnias, and I will put those in the right spot here. Some of these I do have already packaged and labeled, and some of them are kind of a self-serve situation over here. So I do have dwarf sunspot sunflowers. These can be planted now. Mine, they will get 4 to 5 feet tall, so they're not the huge giant ones, but I had them at the border of my garden last year, and so there's some seeds on that. I do have senna, which is a butterfly garden plant. It tends to be a little wildflowery, and by that I mean it tends to be a little bit weedy. It's not one you put by the front door, it's not that front entry plant. But if you have a large space and you want some of this, it's pretty in like a rustic cottage garden type situation. The green one here is dill seed, and so that's the one that we've talked about quite a bit today. You're welcome to take one of those. I do have a vegetable. I didn't have a ton of them to share, but I grew Ozark Razorback. I know, I went to the other side. No, cowpeas. And I ordered these from Baker Creek, and I grew them in my garden. And these you can harvest green like you would a green bean. You can fix them just like a green bean when they're young and in that stage. If life gets busy, and sometimes I get distracted and I'm not able to get everything harvested. So there were times where I had, I didn't pick them, all of them, at the green stage. So that seed, that green bean, will go ahead and dry and mature to a seed pod like pinto beans. And so some of them I ate green, like green beans, and then some of them you just shell them out like a dry bean, like purple whole peas, and then you can store them just in a glass jar and cook them in a stew. You can fix, beans and cornbread. And so they are a little smaller than a pinto bean, but they have really good flavor. As I started cooking with them, it wasn't one that I had even had before. And so it's been really fun. There's not a lot of seed in each one of these, but there's enough where you can grow some and then you can collect the seed. This is an heirloom. And so it is one that's really fun. It kind of has that calico, reddish and white seed to it. So this is one that you can still plant now also. This is one that takes the heat, and last summer, even in the drought and heat that we had, I had good production from these. I went on the website to get their information on just the variety information to put on these, and they don't sell them this year. So I don't know if something happened with their production. There were a lot of comments on the website of people wanting them, and they're not offering them for sale this year. So even on the commercial side of production, sometimes something's available and sometimes it's not. On the marigolds seed and the zinnia seed, I have zinnias packaged, the marigolds I do not, but you're welcome to take some if you would like. And then the hardy hibiscus is this last one. The hardy hibiscus are one that you do want to soak before you plant. They're going to be slower to germinate, but they are a perennial that would come back year after year. The zinnias and marigolds are our annuals, but they are nice pollinator plants to go along with our vegetable gardens. So any of these that you would like to take, you are welcome to, and if you don't, then that's fine too. So it's kind of a learning process of, what these things look like when we go from a flower or a vegetable to a seed that we're going to start with for next year. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about some of these things, and if you have questions, even in September, if you get to a point and you have questions, feel free to call or email. Just reach out and we'll talk about it.